Okay. My name is David Seiden. I'm the Senior Medical Director at Harmony Biosciences, and my in clinical development and strategy. And my background is as a clinical neurologist and sleep specialist. And as you'll see as I move through this presentation, our approach at Harmony is a little bit different um, in terms of what we are studying with a medication called Pitolisant. So, and I'm going to be telling you, giving you a little background on Harmony and the Tempo study, which is a phase 3 study with a very long title, which you can see in front of you. I won't read that. But we're looking at this particular medication called Pitolisant in patients with Prader-Willi syndrome, specifically those who have excessive daytime sleepiness. Just a little, before I do that, just a little bit about Harmony. We're a moderate-sized pharmaceutical company based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the US, and our specialty is developing and delivering treatments for rare neurological diseases. Pitolisant, which is the medication in question, in fact, is already commercialized and on the market in the US and Europe. And in the US, it's been approved for patients with excessive daytime sleepiness, adults and children who have narcolepsy, as well as adults who have cataplexy, which is part of the narcolepsy syndrome, a very specific neurological type symptom. And our approach is, where empathy and innovation meet, we can start bringing a better life to those with these rare neurological diseases. Some of the other disorders that we're studying at Harmony, with regard to some of our other medications in the pipeline, include symptoms relating to Fragile X syndrome and some of the epileptic encephalopathies as well. But our focus here today is on Prader-Willi syndrome and particularly sleep disorders. This was a very interesting paper, I think an important paper that came out in the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine several years ago, which really outlines that there's a growing body of evidence that sleep disturbances are very common in patients with Prader-Willi syndrome. The clinical focus in terms of sleep disorders in the past is really focused on obstructive sleep apnea syndrome, and for good reason, right? Many patients with Prader-Willi syndrome, of course, may be obese, and which would be a clear risk factor for the development of sleep apnea. But there's really more to it, and in fact, really one of the most important symptoms and common symptoms in these patients is excessive daytime sleepiness. And in addition to that, many of these patients also experience what we consider symptoms relating to what's called a narcolepsy-like phenotype. That is, many of the other accessory symptoms of narcolepsy are also experienced by Prader-Willi syndrome patients. These generally are related to some sort of dysregulation between specifically REM sleep and the waking state. And there are a number of different what we call REM dysregulatory symptoms that can result, and patients with Prader-Willi syndrome often demonstrate these types of symptoms. But I think the take-home message here from this particular manuscript is that, we need to see, I think, some increased awareness around recognizing and treating sleep abnormalities in PWS. It's an important issue, and it can impact quality of life. Certainly not just related to the sleep issues, primarily excessive daytime sleepiness, but some of the other associated symptoms that we see with Prader-Willi, like hyperphagia, like behavioral disturbances, can certainly be affected by sleep issues. I mean, I think we can all sort of recognize, right? If we're quite sleepy, certain behaviors can be affected. We tend to be more irritable. We may eat more. I mean, there's a lot of data to suggest this type of interaction. So the question is, why are we studying pitolisant in a clinical trial? Well, if I've sort of touched on that, but if you think about it, and this has already been mentioned, PWS in many ways is a disorder of hypothalamic dysfunction, right? The hypothalamus is a part of the brain responsible for many critical functions. We've discussed this already with some of our other speakers. Certainly, the regulation of hunger and satiety and certain endocrine functions. But importantly, the hypothalamus is involved in sleep-wake regulation. It's a complex system. It involves a number of different neurotransmitters and neuropeptides, including the monoamines, which have just been discussed, but also two other important neuropeptides, one being something called hypocretin or orexin, and the other being histamine, which is also a monoamine. Interestingly, hypocretin and orexin is the chemical that's deficient or usually or almost absent in patients who have narcolepsy. And there seems to be a very complex interaction between hypocretin and histamine, again, which is a monoamine and essentially a wake-promoting chemical. And as I said, it's a complex interaction of multiple chemicals that sort of keep that balance between when one is experiencing sleep versus whether you're experiencing wakefulness. Pitolisant, which is the medication that we're studying in the TEMPO trial and have previously studied in our phase 2 work, essentially increases histamine levels in the brain and thereby acts to promote wakefulness in that manner, although it definitely is more complex than just a histamine effect. There are certainly multiple downstream effects, throughout the brain. We did a phase 2 trial, as I mentioned, that sort of led us to the current phase 3 TEMPO study. Just as a reminder, the phase 2 trial is one in which we obtain preliminary data on whether a drug has the potential to work. These have often been called signal detection studies. And we're also collecting some safety data, including any adverse effects of the drug. And in Harmony's case, in our phase 2 trial, we did actually show a positive signal, which has sort of led us down the path to our current enrolling phase 3 trial. We did see improvements and a clear directional signal in terms of improvements in sleepiness as measured by a particular assessment called the Epworth Sleepiness Scale. But interestingly, we also saw a directional signal in terms of improvements in other domains, a number of the behavioral domains as measured by the Aberrant Behavioral Checklist, particularly irritability, and even some improvements in hyperphagia as well. So that moves us over to the TEMPO study, which again is an ongoing study currently enrolling in the United States, ready to be rolled out in Europe. And I just want to mention a few things regarding the study, including the objectives, a few of our key inclusion and exclusion eligibility criteria, a few study highlights, and then I'll just show you our locations that will be up and running shortly in Europe and Australia. So the objectives of this particular trial, the primary objective is to evaluate the impact of pitolisant, as I said, a wake-promoting histaminergic medication in treating excessive daytime sleepiness in patients with Prader-Willi syndrome. In addition to the primary objective, we're also evaluating whether pitolisant impacts the severity of irritability, as measured by the aberrant behavioral checklist, whether pitolisant impacts the severity of other disruptive behaviors, and whether there are impacts on hyperphagia as well. Selected key inclusion criteria include males or females at least 6 years old at the time of screening, need to be, of course, have a genetically confirmed diagnosis of Prader-Willi syndrome. And you need to have at least a moderate degree of excessive daytime sleepiness at screening and at baseline. And finally, a consistent parent or caregiver, preferably the same person performing these tasks throughout the study. So these are just some of just a few of the inclusion criteria. In terms of exclusion criteria, again, this is not a full list, but certainly we would not want somebody who's previously taken pitolisant for a variety of reasons. And as I said, pitolisant is currently on the market for narcolepsy. As I mentioned earlier, sleep apnea is also a fairly common feature of Prader-Willi syndrome, and we are allowing patients with sleep apnea into the trial as long as it's adequately controlled, and we have certain measures to determine that. We certainly would not want patients participating in another research study while they're participating in the TEMPO trial. And as you can see, there are a number of trials that are currently ongoing for patients with Prader-Willi syndrome, around the world. We would want you to be on a stable dose of medication. And certainly, we would not want you to have some other reason for being sleepy. We want that being related to Prader-Willi syndrome. Highlights, we're putting in about 134 patients. It'll be a global study. As I mentioned, we want an active caregiver, and participation will be a total of about 4 to 6 months with an option to go into an open label. And finally, just so you guys can see the countries and cities where we will be in Europe, where we'll be rolling out the trial within the coming months. And that is the end of my talk. So thank you for your attention.